Try to start my record.
All right. Okay. I've got my recording going. You do what you're going to do there, Jim, and we're ready to pull out of the station.
Take it away.
Okay. All right. So I'm pleased that the people who are attending in person, it's always good to have an audience to talk to instead of just talking to a dead screen. Uh, we're going to proceed with a discussion about N&W Railway Post Offices serving 7 great states. And that's going to be the title of my presentation. And I'll show my screen in just a second. But we'll do a couple housekeeping details. First of all, everybody is muted for now. That doesn't mean that we don't want to hear from you. We just don't want to have any opportunity for background noise that might possibly occur. And during the question and answer session, Jim Cochran, who shows up as N&W host on the screen, can unmute everybody, and you can raise hands or nod your head or whatever, and let us know that you have something that you want to say or ask a question about or contribute. And then the other thing is Jim will be monitoring the chat box. If you have a question during the course of the presentation, let Jim know by typing in the chat box what your question is. He will interrupt me or find a pause or whatever, and we'll talk about whatever it is that's been asked. And so this is going to be a fluid and hopefully a dialogue more than it is just a monologue. I'm not anybody like Jay Leno was or any of these other late night comedians. So I will just proceed with talking about how we're going to do things. So let me get my screen up. Let me get queued, share that screen, and then I'm going to do it from the beginning. Come on, let's go. Let's go from the beginning. So everybody should be, and Jim, you can let me know if you do. You should be seeing my screen. It says linking 7 states with the nation, N&W Railway Post Offices. Got it, Jim?
Yep, I see first slide.
Okay, that's good. Okay, so I did not change the date for this. I wish it was still June. I wish time's moving on way too fast for me, but June was an excellent convention. For those who were not able to attend, you really missed a good time, but hopefully in 2025, when we are scheduling our next convention in the Roanoke and Blacksburg area, you'll be able to attend. We always have a lot of camaraderie, and President Hensley has always made sure to that, as well as our convention host. So I've left the date the same, but obviously today is a day in July, and it's July 28th, Sunday. So what I'm going to do, the next screen is the things that I'm going to talk about. I'm going to have 4 topics, but one thing that I'm going to do that I did not do at the convention, the nice thing about doing it at the convention is you always figure out how you can do it better. I will tip you off right now that there are notes pages to accompany this presentation. It's the slides that you will see, plus a lot of information that's underneath the slide that you do not see as I go through the presentation. I did not take into consideration that when we get into subtopics 4, that the schedules and the route maps and so on like that, and some pictures might not be, well, wouldn't be visible, but people did have it because I gave a hard copy handout. You don't have the hard copy handout. It should be posted on the Society website along with this presentation eventually, so that you have the opportunity to download it and keep it for reference. A lot of good information there. So what I will do is, after I get through number 4, going through the slides, I'm going to back up about 2 or 3 slides into the notes pages and talk about some of the schedules that I'm referring to that you don't see but that I am talking about during the presentation. So anyway, we're going to talk about these 4 topics. We'll do a quick overview of the railway mail service for those people who are not familiar with that, or railway post offices, as well as the functions that they performed. Then we'll talk about the mail train station services on the N&W Railway, and use as an example a letter from Stewart, Virginia to Boyce, Virginia. 2 little burgs who I have a real interest in Boyce, but I learned a little bit about Stewart when I was preparing this presentation and doing the research on the envelope that I'll show you. Now, one other thing, I mentioned that the title was linking 7 states, N&W Railway Post Offices linking 7 states with the nation. For those of you who are really savvy on railroad history, you've heard of some other railroad that will remain nameless that's linking 13 great states with the nation. I borrowed that because I want you to keep in mind that the railway mail service was an interconnected network. You had railway post offices operating over one railroad, but it was not service that was limited just to that railroad. They were making connections at the termini with other RPOs and en route with railroad post offices that were connecting. So it was it was a logistics network, much like we talk about in supply chains today, that things are coordinated, and when they are coordinated well, they are working very smoothly like a well-oiled machine. So we'll get into it now. We'll talk about what the overview of the railway mail service is. What is shown here is a railway mail service Eagle badge introduced in 1899. Every clerk wore these. Now, before 1899, they started out in the late 1870s, having the railway postal clerks actually wear a wool uniform, had a jacket, had a vest, had pants, and a cap, and sort of a Kempe style cap, and had a wreath that said RMS on the hat. And you can imagine on a hot summer day with not much air circulation, those uniforms got pretty uncomfortable. So then they scaled it back in the 1880s and early 1890s to where just wearing the cap was the uniform. Then they changed it in 1899 where they developed this design. It's called an Eagle badge. And it was worn by clerks on their, really, it could be worn any place on their outer clothing, but most often it was their shirt. And some did wear it on a cap, like an engineer's kind of cap, and others wore it on their belt. It was the official designation that they were a railway post office clerk. It was an official identification in the era before you had photo identification. Each badge was serial numbered beginning with number 1. And the first 10,000 badges were issued to the first 10 divisions. So each of them got about 1,000 badges, which is about what they needed for all the clerks in the country at the time. And then they were sequentially numbered after that. So 5968 is pretty early back in railway mail service history. It's probably among the first in that batch of 10,000 badges that was ordered. The nice thing is that they continue that all the way through an era called the Postal Transportation Service that I'll mention later on, where they did a slight variation to the badge. And the numbers got up to something like 98,000. And that doesn't mean that there were only 98,000 clerks at any time or over the history of the railway mail service and the Postal Transportation Service. It just meant that there were that many badges sequentially numbered, because as a clerk retired, they would return the badge and then it get issued to somebody new. So anyway, that's there was never a logo for the railway mail service, but that is the essence, the logo of the railway mail service. So the first experimental route was in 1862 between Hannibal and St. Joseph, Missouri, on a railroad called the Hannibal and St. Joe. That later became part of the Burlington route. And the reason it's called experimental for several reasons. I do not regard it as the beginning of the railway mail service, but it certainly led up to it and it was a very, very important step. Number one, it only lasted a few months. And second, the purpose was to separate mail that was going on the overland stage out of St. Joseph, Missouri, heading west towards California or to the territories to the west of Missouri. And also, it only sorted mail in one direction. There was no sorting of mail coming back east on that route. And the sorting, as I mentioned, was just basically to separate out any letters that were destined for St. Joseph, Missouri versus letters that were going on to the Butterfield overland stage. It only lasted about 8 or 9 months, I believe. So it's an important step. Some people think about that as being the beginning of the railway mail service. In some regards, it was. But the railway mail service really began in 1864, on August 28th, 1864, when the first permanent route was established between Chicago, Illinois, and Clinton, Iowa, on what became the Chicago and Northwestern Railway. And that route stayed around until the 1960s. So, it lasted a long time. And then, of course, the last run of a railway post office is June 30th, 1977, between New York and Washington, D.C. June 30th is when they departed their outgoing terminals. They didn't come to rest until July 1st, 1977. So in some respects, July 1st is when the service really ended. Now, I get picked up in grammar checkers when I do railway post offices, as in last railway post offices. There's a reason for that. And it's because the last RPO, which is the abbreviation for Railway Post Office, was actually a boat on Lake Winnipesaukee that operated and ceased service on September 30th, 1978, a little over a year later. So if you want to know when the last railway post office was, no, not the New York and Washington. It was the Lake Winnipesaukee RPO in New Hampshire. So Railway Mail Service was renamed the Postal Transportation Service in 1949. And the reason for that is by 1949, you had the airmail system pretty well established that started in 1916 and really grew like Topsy after World War I. Then you also had, with the highway improvements and establishing primary routes such as what they call U.S. highways as opposed to interstates, U.S. Highway 50, U.S. Highway 1, and so on like that. The improved highways meant that you started having improved highway services, and they established a highway post office in 1941, and those were used. It was basically a railway post office with rubber tires, and the crew sorted mail much as they did on railway post offices, with a lot more bouncing around and sharp curves, as you can imagine. But their original purpose was when a branch line railway post office for a railroad was discontinued, many times they would then introduce a highway post office, as it was called, HPO, and that took over the service. So that grew, but then they were discontinued in 1974. So then in 1960 had yet another change. The Postal Transportation Service became the Bureau of Transportation. That's transparent to most collectors. They did not call anything Bureau of Transportation, but it was a very significant change because all the clerks that worked in railway post offices were placed under the jurisdiction of postmasters at their major terminals or their outer terminals. And then the Bureau of Transportation had sole responsibility for the contracts and payment and other accounting issues with the railroads. So, three phases. I'm going to collectively call all of those the railway mail service because I'm old fashioned. I hope you are too. And that's how we're going to refer to it collectively as during this presentation. So during most of the 20th century, there were 15 railway mail service or postal transportation service divisions. The N&W routes were in the 3rd and 5th divisions. Now, we're all familiar with the Radford division. We've heard of the Shenandoah division. We know where the Norfolk division. And if I read anything on the N&W list, it's always pokey, 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 pokey. And somewhere out there in Portsmouth, there was some other division out there that went into Cincinnati and Ohio, but I don't know much about that. Anyway, so just like railways, the railway mail service had divisions. I'm not going to go into what the divisions were. I don't think I do. It's the next slide. No, I don't. But it's important if you're doing railway post office research that you know what the division alignment was for routes. And for example, the 3rd division is where most of the eastern lines of the N&W were located in North Carolina, Virginia, and in West Virginia. And then in the 5th division, that's where you find the lines out in Ohio. That's when you get, if you're really wanting to get into railway post office research, you know where to come. Come have a chat with me. I'll tell you everything you want to know. They always define an expert as somebody who can tell you more about a subject than you really want to know. So we'll talk about now what the functions of a railway post office are. And I have a cursor that's probably pretty small on your screen, but it's moving around. And this magazine, I like to use this often, even though it's at, as we sometimes refer to it, the two-tone gray or the cigar band or lightning stripe railroad that will remain nameless, except that you could see the name in the lower right-hand corner. The New York Central System had a series of ads back in the 1940s after they had equipped their passenger trains with very new equipment in 1938. They were publicizing it. And the 20th Century Limited was, of course, their premier train. All sleeping car train. High extra fare. The point about this particular ad was no matter how affluent you were, no matter if you were a movie star, a politician, whoever you were, you could not put step into this car because this was exclusively for the use of Uncle Sam. And so it explained the railway post office car. Now, a series of these ads did appear. They show one where it shows a dining car. I think it was a twin unit dining car. Then they also show one where there's an observation car, a club car with it, and some of the sleeping cars, and the one that had the barber shop and the telephone and all those other fancy arrangements. But this one stands on its own. And it's a nice cutaway view, short of providing an action shot or a video that really shows how clerks work. We're going to spend a couple seconds just talking about there are 4 basic areas in a railway post office car, no matter whether it's a full-length RPO like this one that was 60 feet long. Some of them are longer than that. They were 85 feet, but they had what they called a bungalow at one end. You had basically 60 feet of working space. Then they had some that were only 30 feet apartment RPOs, which meant that they were like an apartment at an apartment house. It was just one unit in a larger building. And then there were 15-foot RPOs. That was after the 1920s when they sort of standardized the lengths. Before that, they had various sizes, and that's Yet another topic we could talk about in early N&W history. Maybe we will someday. So I'm starting in the upper right-hand corner where my cursor is moving around. You have all these pouches and sacks, mainly pouches at this end, that are stacked up. And of course, up there's mail lockers, there's a wash basin, there's the commode, and so on like that. Commode just dumped directly on the track. No ecology back in those days. Anyway, so that was up in this area. And this is mail that's going to be worked or has been worked and is going to be put off at an intermediate station. Then you turn the corner and you come to this area here where the cursor's sort of moving around. This is the distribution cases. Now, this says pigeonholes. Yeah, well, a lot of people like to call them pigeonholes. If you get on Jeopardy and somebody asks you how many pigeonholes there were in a railway post office car, you'd be pretty good if you said there were 1,080, 1080 distribution separations is the proper name for that. And this is where letters are sorted. Basically, it was divided into sections. You can see where a clerk is standing at a section with his hand up, and another one's sort of doing something here. And then you got 3 clerks on this side. Down here, you have the registered mail clerk. Registered mail was handled on railway post offices. And sometimes when they needed a witness for when they opened a registered mail package, they did not open the package itself, but there was an outer jacket or the pouch that they did open up for sorting the mail that was in it. They would ask for somebody to be a witness. So anyway, that person is in here and they're sitting down. Everybody else is standing. Most clerks stood the entire length of their run. Then my cursor's moving around in here. When you have all these letters sorted in the distribution cases, they get tied out into what are called letter packages. A pouch man dispatched it into pouches here for dispatch. Then you have other people here that are opening sacks of newspapers, small parcels, if the small parcels had special handling on them, and what they call flats, which are just large flat envelopes that were too big to fit in the distribution cases. So they were dumping them all out, like this guy's dumping a sack right here. And then they'd throw some of that into overhead boxes, and then some of it went directly into sacks. All these were just additional separations, again, for the purpose of separating mail. And here, when it was getting close to where they were going to dispatch a particular office, they would put a sack under there, put the label onto the sack, and then empty the contents into the sack and put it to the door for dispatch. And then this is mail down here. Again, you got some more mail, mostly parcels and newspapers and so on like that. At this end, there's sacks. And so that is what was going on, except for this little guy right here. Standing in the window, he's looking through the cinder guard, that little attachment that goes right here. That doesn't really do much to keep cinders out of your eyes because, and believe me, you don't want to get a hot cinder in your eye. It'll bore a hole through it. So they were supposed to be wearing safety goggles, which you can't see in this picture. But anyway, so he's looking down the track and he sees the mail crane, raises the catcher arm, and the pouch from a station is on the mail crane ready for pickup. N&W mail cranes look a little different than this, but basically serve the same function. And if there was a pouch going off to that station, you'd throw it out the door or kick it out the door, as the case may be, and then snag that pouch, bring it on in, and off they went to sorting that mail. And they call it the picker-upper. Remember, this is a nondescript language for the general public, but that's a mail crane, and this is a catcher arm, and this is the railway postal clerk. So, great ad. When you get in the notes pages, you can read some of the writing a little bit better, and it is a good short of watching Men and Mail in Transit, which is on YouTube, or Mail in Motion, which is on YouTube, I think, or better yet, sending $21 to the Railway Mail Service Library, which actually supports the library, and getting a DVD. You can get those videos plus a third one. So railway post offices enabled en route distribution of several mail classes. You had first class, which are letters, second class, and fourth, which is parcel post. Now, quiz time for the people I've got you muted so you can't answer. Which of those, think to yourself, which of those do you think is most important? And aside from registered mail down at the bottom, well, yeah, that was sure important. Registered mail was very important. Did you know that the Hope Diamond that now resides in the Museum of Natural History and the Smithsonian Institution, they're on Constitution Avenue in the Museum of Natural History. The Hope Diamond was sent by registered mail by Harry Winston down to Washington, D.C. $502 of postage back in the 1950s. A lot of money for it, mainly for insurance. That diamond got there, and it went by registered mail. If it's good enough for Harry Winston to trust the Hope Diamond, registered mail is still the most secure service that the Postal Service and the Post Office Department offered. Back to the question, which of these are most important? Well, of course, first class letters. Yeah, I mean, that's why they're called first class, but I'll cue you in. Second class newspapers are the most important thing that the railway post offices handle. And the reason was, if you subscribed to a newspaper, you knew that, and it was a published daily or a weekly or whatever, you knew what day you were supposed to get a newspaper. If you didn't get it, you complained to your congressman. Your congressman would turn around and send a letter to the Postmaster General. The Postmaster General would then contact the division superintendent. Well, actually, the general superintendent, then the division superintendent, then the clerk, and then the crew on the RPO. You ever heard of that slogan about sanitary engineering, about what flows downhill? Well, that's the way it is in politics, too. So anyway, second class newspapers actually were preferential, and they were very carefully handled, because if you screwed up, you could be sure that somebody's going to notice and somebody's going to complain. People don't write compliments about mail service. They love to write complaints, and that continues today. But first class letters are certainly important, and fourth class parcel post, which had special handling or special delivery, certainly was up there. Now, in the earlier days of the railway mail service, earlier days being after the 1910s, when there was such a thing as airmail, you frequently had airmail flights that were diverted or they were canceled because of weather, because they were just, those airmail pilots you've heard fly by the seat of your pants. Well, that's exactly what they were doing. They just were in an open cockpit. A lot of times they were using what they called the iron compass. And the iron compass was following the railroad tracks from one location to another. So airmail was often diverted. Sometimes there was a crash too. And mail, not every place in the United States was an airmail stop. So to get the airmail, if you were not at a location in a major city where there was airmail service directly, it had to go by railway post offices, but also airmail was diverted to RPOs during inclement weather. That's one of the things that I really enjoy researching, is special delivery mail, where it's sent by airmail, supposedly. Next thing you know, research shows and can guarantee that the entire movement was made by a railway post office and never saw the inside of an airplane or a cockpit. And by the way, you know how they got the term cockpit? Anybody ever like cockfighting, right? Back during the war, when you're out there, you got a gun in front of your biplane trying to shoot between the blades. You were in the cockpit. You were in a cockfight for your life. Okay, so that's where the term cockpit from. Bet you didn't know that. Anyway, so crews of the railway mail clerks staffed RPOs, and they were post office department employees. No, they were not express employees. Don't make that mistake. They're not part of Railway Express. No, they're not railroad employees. No, none of these folks were ever working for the Norfolk and Western, although it was a fine organization. So the average length for a 60-foot RPO crew was 300 miles. Now, you take the Columbus and Norfolk RPO East Division, which ran between Norfolk and Bluefield, and the West Division was between Bluefield and Columbus. You have one crew that operated the full length over the East Division and one crew that operated over the West Division. For those who are NNW historians, you know that the engine crew had basically a 100-mile day, and they were changing at LaCrew, and they changed at Roanoke. Then they went from Roanoke to Bluefield. 3 different crew districts for the NNW, I think. I'm not that much on how railroad employees worked, and the train crews had similar distances. So that's the thing. The railway postal clerks had extended runs. They were on their feet. The average trip length was 300 miles. You're on your feet for something close to about 8 or 9 or maybe 10 hours trip time. But on top of that, you had an additional 2 to 4 hours of advance time before the RPO departed at the initial terminal. During that time, you set up the car. You had to hang all the pouches, start sorting mail. There was a lot of times where the clerks were actually making a dispatch back to the transfer clerk of mail that they worked while they were sitting in their initial station before they even left. So I'm not going to go into how they calculate days of pay and all of that and the cycles that they worked, but that's a nice, interesting subject. Now, I did a presentation for the NNW Historical Society way back at the first time, or one of the first times we were at Strasbourg. And I showed this picture. And I told people, hey, this is an optical illusion. Did you know it was an optical illusion? Some people see a K-class locomotive, right? When I look at this picture by William Worden, Train 1, leaving Waynesboro, I'll tell you what, thank the stars that William Worden was going around taking pictures. That 30-foot RPO behind there, heading down towards Roanoke, that's what I see. Not that I don't like locomotives. I like the 100 series locomotives a lot. They're very pretty, especially if I could find some pictures, hint, of any passing Boyce Depot. Look in your photo files and let me know if you see any. But the railway post office is the focus for this presentation of this picture. So that's what they look like. This is just another day on Train 1. So service was performed in 3 ways. You had railway post office space. Everybody talks about that because there's postmarks that you can collect and have actually a piece in your hand that was on a specific train, a specific date, just like we're going to talk about near the end of this presentation. Except it doesn't happen to have an NNW postmark on it. But aside from that, you also then had storage mail space. So, all those people out there in television land, you all look at a train and, oh, look at all those baggage cars. No, they're not baggage cars. Some of them are express cars. Some of them are storage mail. And maybe part of one is baggage. You don't have 10 cars of baggage for the passengers that are traveling in one coach and a Pullman. So then you also had a terminal and transfer office stationary units located they were at or adjacent to depots. Now, the railroads rented the space on trains and railway post offices, and then they also leased the facilities. The capacity and mileage is how the railway post offices were paid. So the railroads, about 1/3 of the head-end revenue for a passenger train came from railway post offices and storage mail transportation. Terminal and transfer office facilities, well, they don't show up in the passenger train amounts, but they were certainly factored in terms of the overall revenue that the N&W Railway and other railroads received from the post office department. For the N&W, the principal transfer office, that's TO, that's not a typo. Transfer office locations on the N&W were Norfolk, Petersburg, Lynchburg, Roanoke, Bluefield, Columbus, and Cincinnati. The purpose of a transfer clerk and a transfer office is to coordinate the movement of mail off of a railway post office and or onto a railway post office, and then make connections with other connecting lines, or to make connections with truck routes that were operating in that area, or the connection to the post office in that town or city. So the transfer offices were staffed by usually one transfer clerk. Sometimes there was maybe more than one clerk on a particular shift, and some transfer offices only operated certain shifts. Some were 24-hour operations, depending upon how frequent the trains were that had mail transportation to that location. Some interesting facts: a route agent or railway post office route operated over the N&W from 1871 to 1967. So route agents actually started on the N&W earlier than the beginning of railway post offices. And then Columbus and Norfolk East Division, West Division route facilitated the east to west transfer. And the nice thing about it was you had all these north-south lines that it intersected. You had at Petersburg, you had the Atlantic coastline. You also had the route from Norfolk to Richmond, and that connected to the RF&P. Seaboard Airline was also made a connection at Richmond. And then Southern Railway, when you got over towards Lynchburg, that was another connection that could be made. So, and of course, the Southern Railway system with their line coming down out of Washington, D.C., coming off at Monroe, going over to Roanoke, and then down to Bristol. That was an important link for the Southern Railway with the Bristol and Chattanooga, and also going back west on some of the N&W routes. So anyway, you may find covers for the Norfolk and Columbus RPO. Don't get fooled. Norfolk and Columbus, not Columbus and Norfolk. That was out in Nebraska. You always had, in most cases, except for the Boston and Maine and some of the lines up in New England, the route names were and train numbers were even east and north, and then odd numbers were south and west, and the name of a route was east to west or north to south when they named the endpoints shown on postmarked envelopes. And of course, first-class mail was routinely handled overnight. If you mailed a letter in Norfolk during the railway post office era, when there was more than just one railway post office still operating, you could almost be certain that in most Virginia post offices, you were going to get next day delivery. So now we get to the fourth part of this presentation. As I mentioned at the beginning, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the PowerPoint slides, and then there's some information that you're not seeing in terms of schedules and maps and a few photographs that I'm going to, after I go through the presentation slides, I'll back up and show the notes view and discuss that. And then we'll wrap it up and it'll be question and answer time. So here we have a letter that was posted on the Danville and Stewart Railway Post Office. That's on the Danville and Western Railway, running from Stewart, Virginia down to Danville. A little short line railroad. Its main service was providing service when there were a bunch of woolen mills and other cotton mills and so on like that. That area down around Danville That's Dan River Mills country down there along the river. You had a lot of mills for textiles. But it's a letter that's from the State Board of Medical Examiners in Stewart, Virginia. Now, it's addressed to a Dr. Robert Randolph at Boyce, Virginia. This letter traveled by 2 railroads, 3 RPO trains, 3 RPO routes, and 4 trains, all within 13 hours. A lot of close connections. We're going to talk about that. All for the price of that 2-cent stamp. But before I go into that, I just want to mention who Robert Randolph is. Now, with a railway depot in Boyce, I like to know who some of the people were that were prominent in town. For those of you who know Virginia history, you recognize some names like Randolph, Carter, Lee, and others. They're the first families of Virginia. No, we're not talking about the FFV trains 3 and 6, I guess it was, on the C&O. FFV meant originally famous families or first families of Virginia. And this Randolph was one of them. Now, in 1904, Dr. Randolph wasn't your typical doctor. Dr. Randolph was board certified in a town of about 300 people. He was on the board of medical examiners. He went to Harvard for his medical education back in an era when most doctors sometimes just said, "Hey, I'm a doctor. I've got a quick cure that I'll sell you, and take 2 aspirin and get plenty of rest, and give me 75 cents for my home visit." No, he was a legitimate doctor, and he was well respected. And of course, if you're in the first families of Virginia, you raise horses. That's another thing those first families of Virginians do. They're gentlemen horse farmers. You take up a nice white collar profession in an era when white collar professions are rare, and that's being a doctor, a lawyer, or something else, owning the bank and being the bank president. You're in the hoi polloi. So this is a subject of this cover that we're going to talk about. This is how the N&W was linking, although this is not quite linking 7 states with the nation, it was linking Southern Virginia with Northern Virginia. So Dr. Martin, either his stenographer, he was probably well enough off as the person that he was in Stewart in a small town to have a stenographer who did his typing for him. He carried the letter to the Danville and Western Railroad depot for mailing. Now, train 4 was sitting at the station on advance time, and it departed Stewart at 12:25 p.m. When I go back to the notes view, in the notes view, it actually has a picture of the letter. I'll save that discussion about the request that was being made. It's unusual to find a nice cover. It's even more unusual to find a letter that gives a lot richer interpretation of why the letter was being sent. So Danville and Stewart RPO train 4 only carried the letter as far as Birdville. Try finding Birdville, Virginia on the map now. It was a location on the Danville and Stewart, but not much of a town. But it happened to be a connection where the eastbound train 4, going towards Danville, put it off, and a pouched train 21 for the Danville and Stewart Railway Post Office was coming back the other way in a matter of minutes, returned it westbound, and made a dispatch at Kohler. Try finding Kohler on your map. My hint to you, look near Martinsville. And when I show you the notes pages, you'll see a better map that shows exactly where Kohler is. The recent issue of the Arrow had a nice picture of a derailment of a locomotive and at Kohler. And the nice thing about that station was the Danville and Western went around the back side of the depot, and the N&W was around the front side of the depot. And you can make out both tracks there, even though the subject of that picture is really the engine on its side. Birdville is near Leachville Junction, and so the go-back pouch train 21 was dispatched about 3 p.m. And the train 21 came through there, and then at when it got put off at Kohler, train 21 on the Roanoke and Charlotte RPO train 22 came by at 4:54 p.m. Roanoke and Charlotte, later called the Roanoke and Winston-Salem. That was a joint operation between the N&W and the Southern Railway, at least as far as railway post offices go. So train 22 is going northbound out of Kohler back up towards Roanoke. And so the Roanoke and Winston-Salem RPO was established in 1899, and then they changed it in 1906 to that Roanoke and Charlotte RPOs. Now, there was no post office at Kohler. It was just a junction. And at that point, the railway postal clerk made a dispatch to train 22. Chances are the station agent carried it from one side of the depot to the other. There was probably not a mail messenger there or any other postal employee. Wasn't a transfer office. So the agent probably had the dual duty of receiving mail, making the connection between the Danville and Western and the Norfolk and Western Railway post offices. It was probably an everyday thing. Maybe not for this letter, but every day there was probably a pouch going back and forth at Kohler between trains between those two railroads. So train 22 arrived in Roanoke, Virginia at 7:05 p.m. And then it made a connection to the Hagerstown Roanoke train 2, and that continued up the Shenandoah Valley, what made the last mile delivery at Boyce. And that arrived during 1910 at Boyce. It was approximately 1:15 a.m. So the dispatch was made when Boyce post office was closed, but a mail messenger or the postmaster met the train. And the inbound pouch would not be opened and distributed until later in the morning on December 28th. So basically, in that period from midday afternoon to just after midnight, the train made it all the way up from this North Carolina border all the way up to Boyce, which is near the Maryland border. So the backstamp shows the receiving mark for Boyce. Now, what will puzzle a lot of people in there is it shows that next day, but then it shows 6 p.m. My personal view is that the postmaster probably did not change the 6 p.m. very much. 6 p.m. is probably when the post office closed. So they just left that in there. Any mail that was received, mainly from railway post offices prior to that time, is when it was available for handling and delivery to the post office person. Now, back in that day, you did not have city delivery, especially in a little town like Boyce. So Mr. Randolph or Dr. Randolph probably lived pretty close to the station anyway. I'm not sure exactly where he lived. I can't tell that from census records, but he probably knew when the trains were coming, and after the train had gotten there and after there was a reasonable time for the mail to get to the post office, he probably checked the mail a couple times a day just to see if he had any letters. And so he picked it up and got it basically as a next day delivery. And then this is where I talk about that 6 p.m. So, this is pretty good service. Like I say, as I started out, you have 2 different railroads, 3 different RPOs, 4 different trains, and all in about 12 hours. Not bad at all. Not bad at all. So now, before we go to questions, I'm going to stop the video. Oh, no, I'm not going to stop the video. I don't want to stop the video. Wait a second. I got to do escape. Come on, let's get out of escape here. Let's go to the notes view. So I just want to take a few minutes just to explain home. Where does it say view? Okay. Notes pages. Okay, let me back up a few. Only for this last 4 parts. And I'm not going to be able to make it very, very large. But again, when you are downloading the PDF file, you'll be able to see this in a lot more detail. So this is a letter that was inside. Very interesting letter, because here's the guy who's the secretary of the State Board of Medical Examiners. He knows this Dr. Martin personally. I guess all the people that were on the State Board of Medical Examiners knew everybody else personally. And they were both distinguished gentlemen. And of course, if you took your medical exam, you were designated by number in your examination. It's saying that basically the person who took the exam number 27, which was identifying a particular candidate. He says that I know him personally. Well, it's always the adage, you know, it's not what you know, it's who you know. And so the secretary, Mr. Martin, Dr. Martin, knew the candidate, even though he was using the number 27 to refer to that candidate. Knew him personally, knew that he had some health problems at the time that he took the exams, that he's better now, and was basically asking Dr. Randolph to cut him some slack. You know, us railroaders, when you're going to make a coupling or when you're going to uncouple, you need to make a little slack. And that's exactly what he did in asking for this letter. Don't know if he ever got it. All we know is that he got this letter fast, and hopefully Dr. Randolph made as quick a decision as his letter moved to reach his hands. So in the next notes pages, then you see the Danville and Stewart. You can see the time for train 4. It left Stewart, Virginia at 12:25. For those who are not familiar with railroad timetables, the right side you read up, the left side you read down. That's becoming a lost art for a whole lot of people that are under the age of 30. But anyway, you could see the train 4. The B meant that it was daily except Sunday. All the things pretty much on the, most of the trains on the Danville and Stewart were daily except Sunday, and then they had a Sunday only service, which was designated by the E. But anyway, so it got to Danville. It would have, if it went all the way to Danville, it would have gotten there at 4:13. But it only went to near Leakesville. Got to Leakesville at 3:20 in the afternoon. And then coming through Leakesville the other way on train 21, that came through Leakesville at 3:01, so it reached Birdville a few minutes after that. And then it got back to Kohler at 4:54. That's where those times are coming from. It's the nice thing about railway mail service schedules. You can really pin down, if you know the date of a letter and you know the train numbers, at least how it moved, you can go back and you can reconstruct how a letter moved with a fair amount of reliability, understanding the fact that there could have been actually weather delays that day, train might have been late or so on like that. But we just have to assume that railroads operated a little better than sometimes they do today in the Amtrak era, and that they actually operated on time most of the time. Although I'm holding off on betting on the Danville and Stewart. I think that railroad is probably pretty much when you see it. So anyway, now this is a picture that shows where Kohler is. My cursor is right there at Kohler. Now the north is going up this way, if you see my cursor. South is going down this way, down towards Winston-Salem, north towards Roanoke, up this way. Danville and Western Railway is coming east. It's a east-west railroad. It's coming along, snaking around like this, goes around the back edge of Kohler. I'm sorry, it comes around from there, here, and then around this way, going east towards Danville. It's going this way. And so it put off the pouch at Kohler, and then the N&W coming up from Winston-Salem is coming around this way and picked up that pouch and proceeded towards Roanoke on train 22. So this is the schedule for the Roanoke and Charlotte, circa 1910. The letter's 1904. I have to make a simplifying assumption that the train schedules are about the same. In that era, they did have changes, but they didn't change much. So there's Kohler right down here, 4:51. There's about a 20-minute gap between the time the Danville and Worcester train reached Kohler and the time that this train 22 was heading northbound. A22, the A means that it's daily service. So it was going north to Roanoke, arrived in Roanoke 7:05 p.m. Then you get to the next schedule, Hagerstown to Roanoke. And we're looking for train 2 right here, this column here. That left at 7:20, about 15 minutes in Roanoke to make the connection between train 22 and train 2. And it was not it was not through equipment going between the Winston-Salem subdivision and the Shenandoah division. It was two separate trains, probably pulling in on similar tracks at Roanoke Station. But the mail handlers got the pouch that said N&W, it would have read Hagerstown and Roanoke train 2. They put it aside and got it over to the platform where train 2 was about to depart. And then off it went, and up here, Boyce is between Riverton and Charlestown. That's why I'm saying that it was about 1:15 in the morning that it actually got to Boyce, Virginia. Boyce Depot, I'm uncertain whether or not the agent went there to unlock it at night or whether the mail messenger went over there at 1 o'clock in the morning. In later years, I think the station was just closed. They may have left the waiting room unlocked for passengers. But anyway, however it is, the post office was right next to the station. And coincidentally, it happens to be on a lot that's owned by the Railway Mail Service Library now. So it's a small world. Anyway, so it got to Boyce there within a few hours. So basically within 12 hours, near enough after it was mailed. And then this is a map. This shows how the Roanoke and Charlotte RPO going from their Kohler's right here. My cursor's right there. It's right next to Martinsville, and it went right on up through Rocky Mountain, Boone's Mill, and on into Roanoke. And then the next one here where I've got the thank you, which you'll see in a second. You continue up from Roanoke, you go up the Shenandoah Valley. My favorite line, Shenandoah Division, especially the Hagerstown district. And so Boyce is right here. I truncated it off at Boyce, and you see Boyce right there. So that's the line of movement. It was a very smooth flow, and this is just one example of millions of letters that were handled by the Railway Mail Service. So rather than switch back over to the presentation view, this is the next slide, but we'll go back to this one here that says questions. So with that, Jim, do you have any questions in the chat box, or you can unmute people and we'll do a Q&A session? Did everybody fall asleep? I know I'm good at putting people to sleep. I'm better than melatonin.
I'm going to go ahead and unmute everyone.
Okay. All right. And nothing in the chat box.
Not so far.
That's good. Okay. And, you've got the opportunity to ask a question. If you don't have any questions, that's fine. We'll wrap this up and I'll let you have back a little bit of your Sunday afternoon. I've got dinner on the table in 45 minutes, so I'm certainly wanting to get on out of here, but I'll take as long as we want to talk if anybody has any questions.
Got into crew districts a little bit there, Frank. And basically, there were 5 operating divisions from Norfolk to Roanoke, and then the Shenandoah division from Hagerstown down to Winston-Salem, the Radford division from Roanoke to Bluefield and Bristol, Pocahontas Division from Bluefield to Williamson with all the coal branches in between, including the line down to Norton, and then the Soda Division from Williamson west to Cincinnati and Columbus. And each had its basic operating area. For instance, on the Soda, the crews ran from Williamson to Portsmouth, and from Portsmouth to Cincinnati, and Portsmouth to Columbus, the freight crews. But the passenger crews, just the train service crews, they operated from Norfolk to Roanoke, from Roanoke to Williamson, and from Williamson to Cincinnati and Columbus. So that's kind of an interesting take on how all that transpired back in the steam era.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tim. You know, and that's again, mainly all I want to do is just illustrate that the railway postal clerks had a really long day. They were on duty for 12 hours in an era when the train and engine crews sometimes had a little bit shorter day. But there was other ways that they made up for that in terms of compensation and time off. So, which I did not get into, but that's an interesting topic in itself. But thanks for that description about the crew districts for train and then engine crews, Tim. That's great. Anybody else have any questions, comments?
Frank,
Yes, sir.
this is Raymond Smoot. First, thank you for all you do to preserve the history of the service and share it with the rest of us. I do have one question. It has to do with the exchange of mail and RPO mail between the Norfolk and Western and the Southern. Up until about 1912, Norfolk and Western and Southern shared the same station called the Union Station in Lynchburg. About 1912, Southern built a line essentially around Lynchburg in order to avoid the adverse grades down to and out of the James River Valley. And at that time, the Southern moved most of its traffic to Kemper Street Station, which was about 3 miles southwest of Union Station. So I assume that starting about then that the RPO mail that was to be transferred from Norfolk and Western to Southern stayed on Norfolk and Western and went on to Roanoke, where the routes did share the same station, and the transfer was made at Roanoke from Norfolk and Western to those Southern trains that were going down toward Bristol, at Knoxville, Chattanooga, whatever. Is that correct?
Well, actually, there was a mail messenger that operated, think of it as a truck or a wagon service that operated between Union Station downtown and Kemper Street Station. And it made connections going back and forth from one to the other, as well as mail coming off the Southern at Kemper Street and taking it to the post office, and mail coming off at Union Station that was for Lynchburg going to the post office. So sort of a triangulated route, but it was, no, they were making direct connections. Lynchburg was a heavy connection. You know, now that's, I mean, there's probably more I could dig out on that. If you look at a schedule of mail routes, it will show a lot of stations that were not co-located. Now, outside the scope of this presentation, for example, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, you had several different stations. You had the B&O station, you had the Pennsy station, you had the Pittsburgh and Lake Erie, all that, you know. And so you had in the schedule of mail routes, it showed the frequency and the time and distance between stations and how long it would take to move mail from one station to the next to make these connections. So also in the schedule of mail routes, it would specify what trains, if you were on a particular train for the N&W, let's say, I can't remember if it's 3 and 4, or I think 21 and 22 had RPOs without opening up a schedule. It's when you get to be 73, I start losing track if I'm not looking at the page. They say the things that you write down are easy to remember. But given that, in the schedule, let me actually go back here. This Danville and Stewart down here, this portion down here is called a pouch list. So it's showing what locations and which specific, if it's particular RPO routes or for particular cities, where you're going to make the connection and the frequency of it, and by what train.
Uh-huh.
So if you had something that was like about a 5-minute connection, the Southern Railway's pulling in 5 minutes after the N&W left, but they're 2 separate stations, there would not have been a connection for that train that was only 5 minutes apart. But there was probably in a portion of the table like this called the pouch list that would describe what your connection was. If you were on the Columbus and Norfolk East Division and you wanted to connect something to the Washington and Charlotte RPO, it would show you what train number it is and where you put in the mail off. So it was well structured, well defined, and this, they say that railway postal clerks had to know the distribution for 10,000 post offices as a rule of thumb. Not only did they need to know that, they needed to know all this dispatch information for those post offices. Not only that, if a train was late, they need to know what the second best routing was. So it's an oversimplification to say, oh, well, 8,000, 10,000, 12,000 post offices, they do the distribution for that by studying a general scheme of mail distribution. No, they had to study their schedules. They had to do this. They looked at the maps. They had to learn a lot of practical knowledge so that if they knew their train was running late or it was bad weather and they suspected that a connecting train was probably late, then they had the opportunity for going ahead and making adjustments in how they're going to dispatch mail.
Thank you.
A lot of these other routes, like here in Canova, they had 3 passenger trains each way that originated here. And we had 32 and 33 between Canova and Columbus, 19 and 20 down the big sandy line to Williamson, and 27 and 28 up the old line to Williamson via Dingus, Dunlow, and Wayne. And that train had an RPO on it. And I have an interview, a taped interview with one of the gentlemen that is long deceased that worked as an RPO clerk on that train.
That's good to know.
So many connections and whatever. I remember when I was a teenager, I was down here watching 26 came in to come into Canova, and my neighbor in Huntington lived right across the street. He worked for the post office, and he shows up with a truckload of mail for train 26. So there's a lot of intercarriage between Ashland and Huntington and all these other communities close into proximity to this area.
Yeah, there was that's good additional information there, Tim, and I'm glad that you did the oral history recording. That's something we need to do more of, and those people are fast disappearing if we haven't already captured it. But and I also see a question from Mike Rector. I'll come back to that in a second. There's a route in West Virginia called the Dot and Pocahontas, and that's an interesting one because it started out in I can't remember. I think it started at Dot and went to Pocahontas and then came back. I may have that flipped around because I'm not looking at my map. And again, I've already,
That was all on PB and W. That was a real intricate connection of trains that sneaked up every holler in that area.
and that's exactly the point. It's snaked up, it go on to this branch and then come back and go on to another branch and then another branch. Just so that you know, it did not change its train number, at least on the railway post office postmarker every time it made one of those turns. But that was a one clerk run, and that's going to lead into Mike Rector's question. It's one clerk in a 15-foot car that made the entire trip, and mainly going up, if you will, in one direction. You know, the inbound trip to all those post offices usually was something towards the morning. He was putting off mail a lot of places and not picking up very much mail. And then when the train came back through in the afternoon or early evening, whenever it did, we was getting all the mail coming out of those post offices and then making a main line connection going east, west, north, and south. So it is a lot of those branch lines in West Virginia are fascinating to try to look at the schedules and understand what they were doing. And I'm very fortunate that I was able to, talk to that particular clerk before he passed away. And that leads into a question that Mike Rector had. I have a question about RPO size. Is it too simplified to say that the mail portion were always 15, 30, 45, and 60 feet long? Well, almost there, 15, 30, and 60. After the Steel Car Act, which was actually part of an appropriations bill in 1913, the Post Office Department standardized railway post offices into these three different spaces: 15 feet apartments, 30-foot apartments, and then 60-foot full-length cars. 60-foot cars could also then have an additional length. It could be a 70-foot car or 85-foot car, but the railway post office apartment in that longer car was only 60 feet. There was never, that in my way of thinking or knowledge, a 45-foot apartment. And they made special exceptions. If you start getting into streetcar railway post offices or interurban railway post offices or short line post offices like the Danville and Stewart, where they were using wooden equipment, even though it was after the 1920s, they had lots of variations in space. You had 20-foot space, 25 feet space. Some of the cars were only partial width cars. They weren't the full width of the car. That standardization came in around 1913 going forward, as railroads were required, if they were operating train consists with mostly steel equipment, that they had to have a steel body and steel underframe RPO in the consist. And while I'm at it, a lot of people think the RPO is always right behind the locomotive. It's not supposed to be that way. If there's unoccupied cars being deadheaded, or storage mail cars or express cars that are unoccupied, they were supposed to be placed between the engine and the railway post office car, just so that if there was a derailment or a collision, that there was a buffer. The last thing you wanted to do is have the railway post office car on a ringside seat for a collision. It usually did not turn out well. So, Michael, I hope that answers your question there. Let me see if there's anything else in the chat.
These people were not totally out of danger. In 1910, number 16 derailed with a double header and hit the portal of one of these tunnels on the Big Sandy line and killed 4 mail cars. And the engine crew all lived, but it just hurled the mail, the RPO car against the concrete tunnel portal, and 4 of them died.
Yeah. There's lots of sad stories. And one of the things I should mention, not just to make things longer, but that nonstop mail exchange was a pretty risky business. It was, wait a second. I just want to get this back up here again. Let me get it back over to my contact information. So that's there. Okay. So if the lock was not firmly secured to the pouch that was being picked up, sometimes when you snagged that pouch at 40 or 50 miles an hour, that lock flew off and it ricocheted around like a bullet. And if it hit you in the head, you were probably dead. And then they've also had instances where clerks, when they were making a dispatch with their chain, they were instructed from a safety standpoint never to connect their keychain to their belt. Connect it to a belt loop or some other part of article of clothing, that's sewn on, not something like a leather belt, because they've had instances where that keychain, the key slipped out of the pocket, got tangled up in the twine or the laces, the cords for a sack. They kick the sacks out. Next thing you know, it's pulling the clerk out of the car. And of course, if it's just tied to the belt loop, it's going to break off. But if it's on the belt, that clerk's probably got a one-way trip to the promised land. So it was risky. OSHA would not allow any of this stuff going on now. No nonstop exchanges. When the Celebrate the Century Express was traveling around in 1999 and the year 2000, all the pouches were on display in the Celebrate the Century Express Railway Post Office had to be treated with a flame retardant. It's because of fire, possibility of fire. None of these canvas, they're all cotton canvas. None of these cotton canvas pouches were ever treated with flame retardant. Plus that you had twine dust, this jute twine was flying through the air. When you break open a letter package, you had this brown dust floating in the air, especially on a hot, sticky day, like a July day, like today. And you breathe that in. I'm sure the clerk should have been compensated for brown lung disease instead of black lung disease. But anyway, that jute, very flammable. When that stuff's floating around in the air, that's just like working in a mill where you got flour floating around, you got a spark and it could explode. I don't think there's instances where it did, but it was possible. And OSHA, short of having everybody wear a respirator, they finally made an improvement in the 1960s by having people go ahead and change over to rubber bands. So that took care of that problem. But anyway, it's a service that when it functioned, I usually like to close on the fact that this service lasted for more than 100 years. How many things can you think of that are beginning in 2024 that in the year 2124 are still going to be used? And so, yeah, the railway mail service had its age. It was successful while it operated. It served its purpose. It's like the dinosaurs. If dinosaurs lived for millions of years and they became extinct, no, it's not because they were not a successful species. They were very successful. It's just that the era in which they lived came to an end. And that's the way it was for railway post offices. So with that, any other questions before we wrap it up?
So, Frank, are there any statistics surviving about how much mail was handled on individual routes?
There is a wealth of statistics, and some of it gets close to what you're asking about, Stoney, that is in the annual reports of the Postmaster General up until about 1912, 1910, 1912. At that point, then you had a Postmaster General named Frank Hitchcock, and then you had a Postmaster General after that named Al Burleson. They were on an economy kick. They started trying to cut pay wages. They were trying to increase hours. They were basically trying to get the blood out of a turnip. If Abram Burnett was on here, he could appreciate the blood out of a turnip analogy. But they were compiling all sorts of statistics in an era when you did not have computers. You had room full of people with adding machines. How reliable some of that data is, I don't know. That's anybody's guess. But it was a compilation. Every clerk in charge had to show on a trip report two things. They had two different trip reports. They had one for the personnel that showed the hours on duty for the clerks and what their assignment was. And then they had another one they called the space and mail work report. And that showed how many pouches, how many sacks were opened, and how many letter packages. And so what I think they did is extrapolated that a letter package probably had an average of about 25 letters. They knew that a route on a particular day sorted, 200 letter packages, let's say. And that's how they came up. I'm guessing that's how they came up with some of the statistics. I've never really seen a detailed accounting for some of that data. But when you get to a primary source data, that's the best you got. You don't have anything else to second guess with. They, for a while there, the way they were figuring out mail compensation was weighing mail. Every 2 or 4 years, they would go through and they'd weigh all the mail that was being transported in the railway post offices, and then doing extrapolations from that. What I learned recently in reading a report, a Senate report, is that apparently some of the railroads got savvy to that. They were trying to boost their mail pay. So they arranged for some extra mail to be thrown in there, and get it included in the weighing so that it bump up how much mail was being shown for a particular railway post office when it wasn't really the normal transportation requirement. So I guess there's a way to try to fool the system or gyp the system, however you want to frame it. As they say, figures don't lie, but liars figure. And but there is some data out there, but unfortunately in the later years it doesn't work. Now I'll give you sort of a round number that a railway post office clerk, like you saw in that example for the New York Central RPO in an earlier slide, the production was about 10,000 letters during the course of a trip. Rough number for a 60-foot car. The reason that 10,000 number becomes important is because in a barcode sorter that the Postal Service spent millions of dollars on and put into a mail processing facility, that was about the mail processing work that was done in an hour on one barcode sorter. It's really an apples to oranges comparison, but Postal Service like to make it all the time to say that's the reason why they transferred from capital to labor to capital investment. Again, you can frame all sorts of answers and develop rationale for a position that you want to take using data. Somebody else could probably use that same data and show a different result. I'm not going to get into that. I'll stick mainly to the schedules. And even then, as I conceded, not all trains always operated on time, but it's the best available information that you got, short of a newspaper report that said, oh, the bridge is out, trains are delayed for 2 days, and then trying to figure out why and what the workaround was. Any other questions, comments?
I would like to thank Jim for taking the initiative to get this put together. We've been talking in the society for a long time about doing some of these presentations, and I think they're very helpful and very informative. I myself am doing a presentation at the O. Winston Link Museum on the evening of August 27th. And I am the author of Steam, Steel, and Stars, and I am the last living link of all these people that had any experiences with O. Winston Link. So I'm going to make a presentation and tell my remembrances about him, some good, some bad. I'm gonna tell it like it is. You all know me and how I am, but I don't know what kind of technical assets are going to be available to put that online or whatever. From what I'm hearing up front, it's not going to be very good. That they don't have a real good backup system to do things like that down there. It's going to be at the old passenger station in the theater that they have down there. I'm going down this Thursday to work with her on putting a PowerPoint presentation on. Ken today is coming back from Pennsylvania where he had a family reunion with his wife's people. Otherwise, he would have been on here. But, you know, I think this is something that we all welcome in the future, and we hope to see it grow and expand as time goes on.
Thank you, Tim. And I'm glad that it worked out the way that it did. And just to put a bug in your ear, you know, if it turns out the recording capabilities aren't what they should be at the O. Winston Link Museum, perhaps you can reprise your presentation in the similar format like this, you know, and there's a lot of people in the society who won't be able to get to Roanoke for that. I know that I won't be there, but I'm certainly interested in your comments. And the nice thing is, it's just like the oral history recording that you were referring to earlier. In a way, you are the last living link to O. Winston Link. And it's good to get your personal recollections recorded so that they're preserved for future research. So think about it.
I have many.
I'm sure you do.
I can tell you word for word a lot of the things he said.
No.
Well,
You can be sure if I can tune in for your presentation, I'll be sure to be there. And if not, I'll look for a recording.
All right. Y'all
I
have a
would
good afternoon.
Okay. Did anybody else have any questions?
I would
All
just
right, with
like,
that, Jim,
take
I'll let you go
this
ahead and
up.
close it.
Yep, I would just like to take this opportunity to thank you very much, Frank, for being the guinea pig and kicking us off. I hope this will inspire other people to maybe step up and reprise presentations that they've done in the past, or bring us something new, and so that we can have one of these every few months and keep it alive between conventions. So at this point, I'm probably going to take down the meeting and stop the recording and see what we got.
Thanks for everyone involved.
Hey, everybody.
Okay. Have a good day. And I'm going to stop recording.